Good evening, everyone. I'm Catherine Nichols from the GAA. I'm here to cover a few housekeeping details for the evening and introduce our moderator. We're so glad you can join us for this necessary discussion on an issue of utmost importance for our nation and the UNC community. Tonight's Think Fast Forum is brought to you by the UNC General Alumni Association, the University Office for Diversity and Inclusion, and Carolina Public Humanities. We'd like to thank our GAA members whose dues make programming such as this possible. Also, a thank you to those who submitted questions via the registration form. These questions have been shared with the moderator and our panelists. We ask you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen to submit any questions you may have during our talk. We also appreciate your understanding that we may not have time to get to all of the questions. As a reminder, the recording of tonight's discussion will be made available on the event's website and at Carolina Public Humanities YouTube channel. I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator, Lloyd Kramer. Lloyd is the chair of faculty at UNC, a professor of history, and director of Carolina Public Humanities. We're fortunate to have him lead our discussion tonight.
Thank you, Kat. I'm very happy to be here, and I want to join with Catherine Nichols in welcoming you to this conversation about institutionalized racism in America. As a professor of history and also as the director of Carolina Public Humanities, I've appreciated this opportunity to work with our colleagues at the General Alumni Association and also at the UNC Office of Diversity and Inclusion as we've organized this event. We are gathering at a time of great social, cultural, and economic upheaval in the United States, and all of our lives have been affected by the great pandemic. Equally important, however, we're also living in the midst of another upheaval, an upheaval in our debates about the history of racism and racial injustices in American society. And since the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota in late May, our streets have been filled with demonstrators condemning racism in America and the anti-Black violence of certain police officers in cities around the United States. The history of racism in American society goes back to the 17th century, and we can't really understand what is happening today across America if we don't know the history of slavery from 1619 down to 1865. Or if we don't know the later history of Jim Crow laws, of white supremacy legislation, and the systematic exclusion of Black people from opportunities and education that were available to white people in America. We also gather tonight on the eve of Juneteenth, which has been celebrated since the 1860s in Texas and in other states around the country. The last enslaved people in the South finally learned about the Emancipation Proclamation in Galveston, Texas on June the 19th, 1865. when a Union general brought the news that slavery had been abolished and that formerly enslaved people would henceforth be free and would receive wages for their work. The constitutional abolition of slavery would not come until December 1865, when the 13th Amendment to the Constitution would be ratified. But as we know, real freedom would be deferred as later restrictions blocked voting rights, equal education, equal access to housing and loans, and much else. And there would be terrible assaults on Black communities over the following decades, including thousands of lynchings and brutal race massacres in which white mobs attacked Black communities in cities such as Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898 and Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. We'll never know how many Black people were murdered in those attacks and in others that have mostly disappeared from history. So we begin this evening, the eve of Juneteenth, by recognizing this very long and painful history of racism in America, and by honoring the people of color, including indigenous peoples and others who have suffered and died because of racist policies and actions. But we're also here to discuss how we can better understand our present situation and find our ways forward toward a more equitable American society. Great universities, like the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and we are a great university. Great universities are centers of analysis and creative thinking from which new ideas about the future can emerge. And UNC, like most other institutions in our state, has a history of racist exclusions and discriminations. And it was long entangled in North Carolina's slave system and in the practices of white supremacy that shaped North Carolina's history in the 20th century. We have seen controversial efforts to come to a reckoning with that history in debates about our Confederate statue and the struggle to finally remove that statue, Silent Sam, from our campus. The conflict over that statue was one painful example of our struggle to deal honestly with our complex history and our story of institutional racism at UNC. The buildings on our campus also carry the names of people who advocated white supremacy or who advocated for the slave system. And now we're trying to come to terms with that history as well. Just yesterday, our university's Board of Trustees voted to rescind a moratorium on changing the names of buildings, which had been in place since 2015. This action by our board is another step forward in the honest reckoning with UNC's history. And this action also reflects the influence of UNC's Commission on History, Race, and a Way Forward, which Chancellor Guskowitz appointed last winter, and which one of our panelists for this evening's event, Pat Parker, serves as a co-chair. So we're convening at an extremely complex historical moment for our society and for our university. But we are fortunate here at Chapel Hill to have some outstanding faculty colleagues who can help us confront a key question of this time. What is the nature of institutional or systemic racism? And how can we address such issues within our state and our national institutions, and also within our own university? I am therefore honored to introduce our faculty panelists, and I'm briefly going to summarize their roles at UNC and their achievements. Ted Shaw is the Julius Chambers Distinguished Professor of Law and the director of the UNC Center for Civil Rights. Professor Shaw teaches civil procedure and advanced constitutional law, and his research interests include the 14th Amendment, affirmative action, and housing policies regarding fair housing. He attended law school at Columbia University and worked at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund for over 26 years. He also taught law at the University of Michigan before joining our faculty here at UNC. Dr. Christopher Clark is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science here at UNC Chapel Hill. He earned his PhD from the University of Iowa in 2010 and came to UNC in 2011. His research focuses on minority representation in the United States, with particular emphasis on subnational politics and state politics. His book, Gaining Voice, was published by Oxford University Press last year, and this book examines the causes and consequences of Black representation in the American states. Dr. Frank Baumgartner is the Richardson Distinguished Professor of Political Science at UNC Chapel Hill, and he received both his undergraduate and graduate training at the University of Michigan. He received his PhD in 1986, and he taught at several other institutions, including Penn State, before coming to UNC in 2009. He is the author of several notable books, including a recent work called Deadly Justice, a statistical portrait of the death penalty, which was published by Oxford Press in 2018, and Suspect Citizens, What 20 Million Traffic Stops Tell Us About Policing and Race, published by Cambridge University Press in 2018. And our fourth speaker is Patricia Parker, who is the chair of the Department of Communication at the University of North Carolina here in Chapel Hill, and co-chair of UNC's Commission on History, Race, and a Way Forward. She received her PhD at the University of Texas and came to UNC in 1998. Professor Parker is also the director of the Graduate Certificate in Participatory Research, and her research, teaching, and engaged scholarship focus on social justice, leadership, and decolonizing organizational communication processes. She's also the author of the forthcoming book, Ella Baker's Catalytic Leadership Praxis, a primer on community engagement for social justice leadership. So you can see that we have a very distinguished panel of UNC experts, the kind of people who can help us find a way forward. And the format is going to be that I will ask each panelist a question and a sort of subsidiary question that's related to that. And we'll go through the group and each panelist will respond, and then we'll go to more questions, and then we will move into additional questions coming on the live Q&A. So I begin with Professor Parker. And I want to note that many people may understand the nature of personal racist attitudes and behaviors or personal racist actions. But we're going to focus this evening on institutional racism. So I think it's important to begin with this question. What do you see as the main characteristics of institutional racism? And how does institutional racism differ from or resemble individual racism? And related to that question, and related to your own work, how does institutional racism appear specifically in schools and in universities, such as UNC, or in our media institutions? So I turn to my colleague and friend, Pat Parker, with that big question. Pat?
Yes, hello. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, Lloyd. It is indeed an honor to be here having this conversation when there are so many important conversations to have at this moment. And so I'm glad to be a part of this conversation about institutional racism. On the question of how I see the main characteristics of institutional racism, I think I have to start with thinking about first the question of what is racism. I understand racism as a system of power that intersects with other systems that's perpetuated often through institutions and throughout the world. And in speaking specifically about institutional racism in universities, as I understand racism as a system of power, of hierarchical power, that privileges whiteness and white supremacist ideas, then we start to think about how our institutions begin to reflect those hierarchical relations. The sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva describes what he calls three categories three racialized categories: white, honorary white, and Black. And if you think about that in terms of the ways that that power is configured in those relations, right? Then we can start to see how institutional racism is perpetuated. So as I think about institutions, we can think about the structures in institutions. So the composition of our faculty, for example, the curriculum that makes up the institution, and most importantly, I think the culture that makes up an institution. And it's through those characteristics that I think that inequality, inequities are perpetuated. And I think they're perpetuated communicatively in the ways that we speak to each other, our interactions, and the unconscious bias that can perpetuate prejudices and racism, often without, again, as in terms of thinking of unconscious bias, without understanding that racist ideologies are driving those interactions. And if it's at the level, it can be at the level of intrapersonal. In other words, you don't have to be white to perpetuate racism. So there can be an internalized internalization of these racist ideologies, right? So that becomes perpetuated in our interactions, and then in the practices, and ultimately a culture and a system of racism. So I'll stop there unless you want me to continue, but that's how I understand. And I see that as a foundation for starting to dismantle some of the structures of racism. You're muted, I think. I'm not hearing you.
Lloyd,
it has a lot to do with power. Now can you hear me? This Zoom land doesn't always work as it should. Thank you, Pat. We'll come back to these issues. And I want to turn next to Frank Baumgartner. Frank, I want to ask you the same question. What do you think is the nature of institutional racism? How does it differ from or resemble personal racism? And how has this institutional racism evolved specifically within police departments and policing practices?
Okay. Let me say what a pleasure it is to be on this distinguished group with several of my friends, including you, Lloyd, and then Ted and Chris and Pat. It's really a pleasure to be here. I want to second what Pat said about racism has to involve some kind of hierarchy of power and legitimacy. And so I know that many people are hearing for the first time in polite company the phrase white supremacy. And I think when we think about racism, we have to understand that racism implies a hierarchy that one race is at the top. And so when we hear this phrase white supremacy that many people might not be familiar with in its kind of academic usage, we have to understand that what that simply means is that white men, in particular heterosexual white men, are at the top, and other people can, other people suffer from that, whether it be women, blacks, or other minorities. But anyway, racism can't just be a system of difference. It has to be a system of hierarchy and power. I want to mention a couple examples of institutionalized rather than simply personal racism, and point out that personal racism could come in two flavors or types, explicit and implicit. And we're all familiar with explicit racial prejudice and explicit racial hatred. And I think that's a small percentage or a small share of all the types of racial animus or racial difference or racism that our system, our society experiences. And so we oversimplify by thinking that what we have to worry about is overt racial prejudice and hatred. There's also implicit racial bias, which we all have because we've grown up in a society where there is a hierarchy. And that's for another time, but I did want to mention the difference between explicit and implicit racial bias, but those are both at the individual level. At the system level, let me give some examples of rules and procedures that generate significant racial differences to the detriment of non-whites. And I'll start with a personal example. When I was in high school, and Ted Shaw will remember this example because it was a very prominent Supreme Court decision. This was in 1974 at the point where we were finally implementing Brown v. Board, which was from 1954. And it wasn't until 1972 that it reached perhaps its greatest milestone, which was the integration of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg public school system, thanks to the Julius Chambers, for whom Ted Shaw has his distinguished professorship named after him. But 2 years later, in my hometown of Detroit, Michigan, there was another landmark ruling by the Supreme Court. And the question before the justices was, can you force an entire metropolitan region to integrate their schools across district lines? Detroit, of course, even at that time, was a majority African-American Black city. The public schools were about 85% Black. And the idea of busing kids around the city of Detroit without busing some of us into the suburbs meant that it would never be adequately integrated by race. But the suburban communities virulently opposed any type of cross-district boundary busing. And that was the nature of the Supreme Court decision. And the court came down on the side not to mandate cross-district busing. What that meant was that we all continued to go to segregated schools. And the court used an argument about the independence of each of these school districts to reach that. They didn't reach an argument that was explicitly driven by race, but they said that each school district is independent from the others, and you can't force one school district to take the pupils or students from another school district. Well, that had a monumental impact on our educational opportunities. I could point out many, many examples of this. I would say, and from my own research in the area of traffic stops, a Black driver, just by getting into his car and driving, has about twice the odds in North Carolina of being pulled over. And once pulled over, they have about twice the odds of being searched after that traffic stop. So that double whammy means that that Black driver, compared to me, has about a 4 times greater likelihood of being searched if they drive. Is that institutional racism, or is that personal animus by the officer? It's institutional to a large part, because we find that officers in every agency engage in these disparate patterns of behavior depending on who's the driver. So I could continue on with examples. They're in the newspapers every day. They come from the fields of education, medical, healthcare, banking, housing, segregation. The list goes on. So every major institution in American society has these biases built into our histories.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll come back to those issues also, and including the policing issues. I want to turn now to Chris Clark, and I want to ask the same question that I posed to our colleagues. First of all, what do you see as the main characteristics of institutional racism and how they may differ or resemble individual racism? And then more specifically, because of the work you've done, how has institutional racism developed in political structures or voting regulations or government policies?
Yeah, thanks for your questions there, Lloyd. And again, I'm very happy to be here. And you can see I'm in a closet. It's one of the few quiet places I can find here. So COVID-19. So excellent question. And I only have a couple things to add to what both Pat and Frank said. I mean, to me, and I had these conversations with friends all the time, what really distinguishes sort of individual level of personal racism from structural racism really has to do with the fact that like the very systems, the very structures themselves lead to racial and ethnic groups having different outcomes. And it's very similar to what was said before. So one of the ways I think about this is, as Frank mentioned, you look at mortgage lending. So I'll give you just a brief example. I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, and in the actual city itself. And growing up, I always knew when we went east of Truth Street that the houses tended to be more dilapidated. There were more African Americans there. You could literally be on the same street, 39th, 51st, 12th. And when you went west of Truth, the homes themselves were nicer. And it wasn't until I got older and I read a book more about the history of Kansas City and just in this broader context of mortgage lending and redlining and so forth that I understood that that wasn't just something that randomly happened, right? That these very living patterns were a consequence of decisions that banks made, decisions that real estate agents made about where to show Black people homes and all that. So it may not have been that each real estate agent or that the bankers themselves spat in the face of these African-American people, right? And were explicitly racial in the way that Frank mentioned. Was the rules of the game themselves, the very structures themselves led to African Americans having a far worse outcome, not just different, but a worse outcome as compared to white. So to me, it's like when things are embedded in the system themselves. I'll give one other brief example here. Think about education and this idea of legacy admissions. And again, I know there are alums here, and I'm by no means I'm trying to or anything, right? But something that's food for thought is when you have in place decisions that allow people to get into school because their forefathers went there. That's not going to help African Americans and other racial minorities in the same way as it's going to help whites, right? And so I don't want to necessarily say it's racist in the same way as mortgage lending is, but I would at least raise the question that it's something we ought to think about in terms of how the rules themselves impact people's lives. In terms of my own research, there's a lot I could say. I guess what I'll focus on now is looking at voting. And research has come out recently pointing to voter ID laws. And depending on who you read, you might get a different take on it. But there was a paper published in 2017 in one of the leading political science journals, which showed evidence that racial minorities are disproportionately affected or far less likely to vote when they live in states with voter ID laws. And so, again, that's something that you might get, sort of different news about, and depending on how people crunch the numbers, they might try to come to different interpretations. But, most of the evidence that you come across in social science suggests whether it comes to getting access to an ID or the act of voting itself, that it's going to have this disproportionate impact on people of color. And so that's one example. Another example, and one of the things I often like to tell my students is you can count on a few things in life: death, taxes, and there being a fight over gerrymandering in North Carolina. And so gerrymandering is another great example, the way in which these invisible lines are drawn to concentrate power, and especially in southern states like North Carolina, drawn in a way to it really suppress the voting power of minorities. I found some of this in some of my own research. I'm happy to unpack that a little bit later, Lloyd. But I think of gerrymandering as another example, and how in the realm of politics in particular, how power is wielded in a way to minimize the power of and influence of racial and ethnic minorities.
Thank you. Yes, we can come back to the political structures and the gerrymandering. Those are important themes also. But I want to turn now to Ted Shaw. and ask the same question that we've been discussing. What is institutional racism, and how does it differ in some ways from personal racism? And then specifically, how does it play out in legal institutions, the criminal justice system, court proceedings, and incarceration?
Well, first, let me thank you for the invitation to be with you and be part of this important conversation today. I had a moment of scariness because I lost the internet connection, so I didn't know whether I'd make it in, but here I am.
Well, I'm very glad.
I have to say, to Chris, that I know Kansas City very well. I was one of the lawyers who worked on the Kansas City school desegregation case for years, gave a good part of my life to that, and argued that case the last time I was up in the Supreme Court. It was the last mandatory school desegregation case that the court heard, and it decided in 1995. So we could have a long discussion about how segregation and structural inequality played out and what the causes are in Kansas City, which is really typical of many other cities around the country. And in fact, I've come to say that people drive through neighborhoods, they see residential segregation and school segregation, and they think that this is a natural phenomenon. And nothing could be further from the truth. It's unnatural. Segregation, whether we talk about housing patterns or whether we talk about education patterns or inequality in many other forms, segregation is a consequence of years and years, decades and decades, and really hundreds of years, a continuum of slavery through Jim Crow, right on down to the present, of private actors who interacted with governmental actors on the state, local, and federal level to create the conditions that we see today. There's a wonderful book I recommend to all of you, if you haven't read it yet, by Richard Rothstein, called The Color of Law. It's not the only book to tell this story, but it tells how our communities around the country came to look the way they did. When I think about structural racism or discrimination and inequality, I think about these things to which I'm referring, which have been baked in over time into the DNA of our society. As I said, people tend to think that these things are a consequence of nature or choice when they are not. And once baked into the DNA of our society, they create inequality that is lasting. So, for example, the gap between Black people and white people in this country with respect to wealth, for every dollar that Black people have in this country now, approximately white people have 100 times, a little bit more than that, that wealth. And wealth is in many ways more significant than income. Income is significant, but in terms of who has the cushion, for example, to deal with the effects of what's going on with COVID-19, it's a very different story for many African Americans and white Americans because of all of this history. So when we think about structural racism and inequality, we're not just talking about people using the N-word or having bad attitudes or a bad policeman. When we talk about law enforcement, as Lloyd Kramer asked me about, among other things, we're talking about a difference in relationships between Black and brown communities and law enforcement, in which, in effect, there's a war on Black and brown communities in the name of the war on drugs, for the most part. But these consequences, no pun intended, color the interactions between police and law enforcement every day, so that Black folks have to think about how they interact with police in a very different way when, for example, they get stopped, as opposed to a white person who gets stopped. We have the difference in incarceration rates in this country now, largely as a consequence of the war on drugs. And it's hard to convince many people of the truth of this, but it is a fact. Black people don't use drugs in higher rates than white people, but every step along the way, who gets policed, who gets arrested, who gets charged, who gets tried, who pleads out, who gets convicted, who goes to jail, the length of sentence, all of that is color-coded in our country. And largely it's because of the difference in the way Black people are policed. And finally, for at least for the moment, so we've been saying this for decades and decades, years and years, that we being not only civil rights lawyers and activists, but Black folks generally. And one way or another have been told for many, many decades and years that, we were one way or another crying wolf. We were being gaslighted. And it's only now that we have these videos that we're beginning to see a change. And thank God for it. I'm thankful for all of the people of all backgrounds and races who are marching now, and they're seeing it and beginning to get it. But this is not something new. It's baked into our country, and it is supported by Supreme Court and lower court jurisprudence in ways that are insidious.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll come back to some of these issues as well. But I appreciate what you said, and very much aware of the impact of the war on drugs and differential outcomes in many of these communities. I want to move to a second round of questions, and then we're going to move to some others that have also come in from our audience. The second round of questions has to do with specific reforms or changes that are now being proposed to destabilize or change institutional racism. So I want to come back to Pat and ask, what are examples of some of the specific actions and changes that people are seeking in universities like UNC, and perhaps even in your own work on this Commission on History and the Way Forward? How do we find our way forward at universities and in the media to deal with the problems you described earlier?
Well, it's a good question, and it's a good question to ask someone who sees herself as a communication scholar, because I think it is fundamentally a communicative problem. If you think about how narratives circulate, right, as discourses about what, as I think Frank talked about, these hierarchies that legitimate whiteness as the dominant ideology, dominant culture, the images that reflect, a dominant culture that seems to be baked into the system of hierarchy. That means that the other people who are not within that hierarchy, within that category, don't have that legitimacy. So this is how I'm understanding the problem of how racism persists. I think that's the question, right? Why is it that racism persists? And you, Lloyd, as a historian, has told us the different versions, right, of this, of a racist structure that has persisted across these centuries, right? And so change, I believe, has to come in changing the narrative about, I'll take it just down to the work of the commission, who we are as a university, what we value, how we live those values every day and how they're reflected in our institutions in terms of the structures, right? In terms, I mentioned earlier, the composition of our faculty, of our staff, the number of professors, full professors in terms of rank, distinguished professors, it's, one way, but it's not really just about status. It's about, what we value. If these are the things that we value, that should be, it should be reflective of the entire human experience in terms of people who are a part of this institution. So I think that part of what the work that the Commission on History, Race, and a Way Forward is trying to do is to change that narrative and to have a conversation, have an inclusive conversation about what the way forward is. And so I just want to state our specific charge from the Chancellor, which is to explore, engage, and teach the university's history with race, and provide recommendations to the Chancellor on how we as a university community must reckon with the past. And so we have 3 years in which we're going to be focusing on learning, curating, teaching, and reckoning with our past in terms of the looking at the archives and the history of race, how it has been manifest in the symbols of white supremacy, as you've mentioned earlier, that perpetuate on our campus, but also, as I've mentioned, in terms of our curriculum, the development, to what extent are we engaging with the indigenous knowledges that in my work, I talk about decolonizing the university, decolonizing the curriculum, right? So really reckoning with those histories that silence some voices while lifting others. So those are some things that I think are important. And I believe that it happens through, this may be getting to the next question, but I think that it happens through this type of engagement across difference. And I feel like that, what I really want to emphasize is that, as Ted said, the videos that we see have called our attention to what is happening, right? And calling us to question what is happening. And I think the crux of what our work is to getting to that why. Why is this happening, right? Why does racism persist? Why are Black bodies the target of violence? And for that matter, why are children locked up in cages at the border? Why, we can get into a number of things. And so I think we start there, and that's the way to start to change the narrative, to start to go deeper into that question of why, and to use all of our resources to engage in that conversation.
Could I ask, has the commission that you're involved in, the Commission on History, Race, and a Way Forward, have you been looking at the issue of buildings as a form of communication, the naming of buildings?
Well, I have to tell you that the commission is just starting its work. We have a 16-member commission, and we're looking at a number of priorities, but absolutely that's one of, it's understood that that's one of the primary areas of our work, especially given the decision that was made yesterday. And my co-chair, Jim Laludis, who is a professor of history, he and I have worked with the other commissioners to sort of prioritize the work, but we certainly are working in that area. And I think a hallmark of this work is not only how the names on those buildings that represent a violence against Black bodies and the perpetuation of chattel slavery, the enslavement of Black bodies, and before that, the annihilation of Native peoples. But how that story continues to have currency in as many of the descendants of the enslaved people who helped to build the university are still in our community, are still in the local community. So really having that larger conversation about the meanings of those symbols. Well, I really want to emphasize the conversation. So it's, all of us are complicit in creating this system. And so it takes all of us to be a part of the conversation. And so I'm looking forward to that work. It will be difficult, but it will be necessary.
Well, thank you for what you're doing. And I have to say, as a historian, I can't think of a better place to start than the past for a way forward. So I want to turn now to Frank, and I want to ask the same kind of question in terms of what kinds of specific actions or changes are being sought in the institutional practices of policing. And I know you're also serving as co-chair of the Campus Safety Commission. So this is an issue that's state and national, but also right here at UNC. So what kinds of things are people proposing to deal with the problems you described earlier?
Well, I would say that the interesting thing about the moment where we are right now is that there seems to be a consensus that the system is broken. And as Ted mentioned, people who've been paying attention and have been on the losing end of that system have known that it's been broken for hundreds of years. There's nothing new about that. It reminds me sometimes when I've given talks about my research on traffic stops and described the extent of the racial disparities and outcomes with police encounters. Sometimes there'll be a Black man in the audience who will get up after a long time of looking bored and say, you know, I cannot believe that they pay professors like you to write books on this topic because everything that you've said is obvious and we've known this forever. At the same time, often there's a white audience member who will say, oh my goodness, I'm shocked that these things are happening. So I think what we're having now is at least the beginnings of a consensus that the system is the result of a long-standing racial hierarchy, and it has many, many components. So if you don't believe that the system is broken, it's hard to reach a consensus on any fixes or solutions to the problems if you don't agree there's a problem. And for many of us over the decades and centuries, there hasn't been a problem. It's actually a system that works out quite nicely, thank you, if you happen to be in the advantaged group. And since many of the decision makers in influential positions throughout every institution of American society have been in that advantaged group, they've been able to reach a consensus that no, in fact, these are just disgruntled people who want something for nothing. And actually the system is the greatest system the world has ever known. So if you don't believe that there's a problem, you won't support solutions. Now, I think we've turned a corner and hopefully we'll stay in that place. Now, which solutions are going to be adopted? I couldn't tell you. There's going to be hundreds and many of them will fail. And I hope that a few of them will succeed. With regards to policing, I think people are asking serious questions about exactly how many things should be illegal. Maybe we have too many things that are illegal. I was talking to a reporter today about the arrests, the racial disparities in the arrests for trespassing. Why do we have a law for trespassing? Why can a business owner call the police when a homeless person is sitting on the sidewalk outside of their store? That business owner can call the police and have that person arrested for trespassing if the person refuses to move on. But it's a public place and the person is not being violent, but store owners might not like to have them there. So why do we have that law? So I think we're going to be asking a lot of questions about whether we really need many of the laws that I think were designed not to protect our property and not to protect us from violence, but to promote a social hierarchy, really, to put it bluntly. So I think there'll be many, many proposals. I also wanted to, and I don't know which ones will stick, which ones will be effective, and which ones might prove not to be effective. I do want to mention that every one of us has to imagine and recognize that none of these solutions are going to be quick work. Ted Shaw mentioned the fact that there's a wealth disparity. Well, that wealth disparity is the result of hundreds of years of overt, legalized discrimination. Black communities haven't been able to accumulate the wealth because they weren't allowed to, their members weren't allowed to work in certain industries. There was wage discrimination, housing discrimination. The value of your home is usually a person's most important asset. If that didn't appreciate over time, then you couldn't pass on to your children the accumulation. So there's all kinds of differences. And I would just point to a way of thinking about this. That is, if we suddenly say, well, as of 1964, there's no more de jure discrimination, voting rights are equal, other rights have been equalized, and we call that the starting line. Let's say you're playing Monopoly and everybody's been playing Monopoly for 200 or 300 years. And then you come into the game with no property and you're allowed to play along the same rules as everybody else, but they've already been accumulating property for many, many decades in previous rounds of the game. It's not an equal starting line, even though it might appear to be legally. And we're going to have to continue to confront those issues of the historic legacies that have been left to us. So it's not going to be an easy fix.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. It's a long history of patterns of wealth ownership as well. So I want to turn to Chris next about what kind of specific actions and changes are being sought in the political process. You mentioned earlier about voter registration or gerrymandering or IDs. What kinds of things are people proposing to try to alter the situation?
Yeah, excellent question. And so just to talk a little bit more about that, and as I enter into my answer, one of the things I want to note and just be clear about is, so one of the interesting things about election administration is that subnational governments have so much say. And so, I mean, my focus is often on the state level, but then also at the county level, right? That's actually, they have county boards of elections, and they actually wield a considerable amount of influence as well. And so one of the things that I'll point to, like I said, I was really encouraged by, so I had the opportunity of teaching Introduction to Southern Politics here in North Carolina, and a great class, and I enjoy it. It's so much fun. I don't think I'll ever run out of a job. There's always so much material that just comes my way every day. And what I want to point to, however, is that in November 2018, in Florida, they actually passed a ballot measure to actually make their felony disenfranchisement law less severe. And so I probably could have led off with that as another example of laws that actually disproportionately affect minorities, in particular African Americans. Studies, research has long shown that African American, especially African American men, are much more likely to be unable to vote at some point in their life because of these laws. So if you are a convicted felon, so in some states you can never vote again. In others, if you owe like alimony, if you owe like child support money, then you can't vote. My point in saying all this is that a state like Florida, which was in that really severe restrictive category, actually moved out of that. It actually softened how restrictive the law was. And so you see that movement taking place in a place like Florida, which I was actually surprised that it passed that year. And so you say you have other states as well, maybe implementing automatic voter registration that happened in Oregon a number of years ago. You have some states that allow for all voting, all elections by mail. The idea is convenience voting. Let's break down the barriers. Let's make it as easy for people to vote. Let's make it as accessible of an act as possible. And that will be one way to increase voting among African Americans and among other racial and ethnic minorities, okay, to reduce the costs, what you actually have to do in order to cast a ballot. But then, of course, what ends up happening is that there's movement on the other side, and the voter ID laws are a great example of that, because that additional step, that additional sort of requirement for voting gets in the way, all right, and it can suppress voter turnout. And so I guess what I'll say to Lloyd and everyone else that's listening here, is that what ends up happening is that states have a lot to say over what goes on. And so it really depends on who's in the state legislature, who's the governor, right? And who actually wields power subnationally goes a long way towards whether or not you see states making a concerted effort to make it easier for people to vote, or if you see them making an effort to put into place laws to make it hard for people to vote. I'll say one other thing too, and I've been encouraged by some of the news I've heard, just in terms of listening to what states are saying and thinking about. My sense is, and going back to my point about gerrymandering, I think what people realize is that when you allow legislators to draw their own districts, that's a highly problematic process. And so why not put it in the hands of a commission, a nonpartisan commission, some body of actors that is not the legislators themselves. And so maybe in future years, we'll see more and more states moving towards that, as opposed to what we have here in North Carolina and in many other states.
So some kind of nonpartisan commission that would decide how the districts are drawn. That could have a huge impact.
Oh, yes, I think so. I think you make a difference in terms of how much you see minorities packed in the districts and their power limited just in those places, as opposed to being a presence throughout the state in various districts. And then as a result, given representatives an incentive to represent their interests. So yes.
So it's also very interesting what you say, that we often think of politics playing out in Congress or the national level, but you're putting a lot of emphasis on what happens at the state level.
Yeah, it happens to be what I research, Lloyd, and so I'm biased in that sense, but also well aware.
No, I think it's terrific. It's what
No,
they
I think
say,
that's what
all politics are local or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's on the tip O'Neill. But yeah, I mean, I definitely think that there's a lot of influence. And again, if Congress steps in, and some of the most important advances we've seen have come out of the national level.
Yeah.
And so I want to give them credit for that. But I also know that in this day and age, you can't ignore subnational politics.
Yeah, thank you. So Ted, I want to come back to you now about specific actions in terms of addressing the problems you described, including the problem of the war on drugs. But what kind of specific steps can be taken to address that problem of arrests and mass incarcerations?
Well, quite coincidentally, yesterday I learned, last evening, that someone whom I represented for a number of years and tried to get released from federal penitentiary, and we were unsuccessful in doing it in the way we were trying to do it. And this is under the Obama administration. I have to be frank and say that we were trying to get clemency for this individual who made some mistakes, but his crime involved nonviolent offenses. He got caught in a sting. He wasn't using drugs. He wasn't selling drugs, but he was involved in providing an escort to people who were, or allegedly were. Here's my point. Life sentence without parole. No record before, served in the military, no violations before, life sentence without parole for nonviolent drug offenses. The reason that he is going home next Friday is not just the legal arguments that we made, because although we didn't get clemency for him, our petition was picked up by other lawyers who used it right now to do a COVID-19 release petition. And that's why he's going home. COVID-19 is doing in some prisons for nonviolent offenders who have long sentences what the law wouldn't do before. There's no reason to keep these people incarcerated for these lengthy sentences. And one of the interesting things that we've seen over the last few years, I have to tell you that I would shake my head and just mutter, or worse, when I would see these news stories. The heroin addicted mother, and it's not who you think, in the teaser, and it would be white women, suburban women. And people began to see those people differently and treat them as human beings and give them second chances or more. When they demonize Black folks and lock them away, which is part of our long history of the way we treat Black people in this country. What can we do? We can change our sentencing laws. We can release nonviolent offenders. We can believe that people should have second chances, in some instances, maybe third chances. We can have more opportunity in communities that, frankly, for many of the people who live there, never had much in the way of opportunities. And so that's why people went on the street and began to do things in ways that were not legal. Look, I'm not talking about excusing violent offenders, people who kill and injure. I'm talking about nonviolent offenders who make up the major part of the prison populations in many of our federal and state prisons. So that's one thing that we can do. We have to go back and talk about education. Frank talked about or alluded to a 1974 decision, Milliken versus Bradley was the name of the case in Detroit. When you put that decision together, which insulated suburban school districts from urban school districts for desegregation purposes. You put that together with San Antonio versus Rodriguez in 1973, which basically said that economic status, poverty, is not a constitutionally cognizable issue. And so poor people end up in schools that have many fewer resources. It's not even close. What you get is racially separate and financially unequal school districts that are sanctioned by law. It's worse than pre-Brown versus Board of Education with respect to what the law allows. Can we do something about that? Yes, we can if we have the will. We can go on down the line and we can talk about the ways in which, we have the sense in this country. You hear people say, my parents, my grandparents, they worked for what they got. Nobody gave them handouts, etc. Well, I'm sure they worked hard. But a lot of wealth in this country, most wealth, one way or another, would not be created had it not been for some kind of government involvement. Again, look at Richard Rothstein's book about the post-World War II years in which the suburbanization process of America took place. And it was the way the middle class that, as we know, was created. And the point is this: it was created through governmentally insured housing programs that were racially segregated and that were explicitly unavailable to African Americans. The Levittowns, if you know what that is, of our country. So should we do something about economic inequality and opportunity? Yes, although when we've tried to do that, we've often gotten pushback in the way of saying that people want welfare, they want government help, they're not willing to work for it. There are a lot of folks who got what they got in this country. I'm talking about white folks, with all due respect, with government assistance one way or another. One final thing on that score: I live in a house. I grew up in public housing. People talk about people in public housing as if they should be punished for being poor. And they are subjected to other kinds of regimental policing in ways that white folks aren't. I get a break on taxes because of the tax laws in this country. They may be changing now, but mortgage interest deduction, that's a break for people who are already doing relatively well. Please and thank you. And yet, those kinds of breaks aren't available to poor people. I could go on and talk about the policies that we can adopt that should change. But the one thing I want to say is something about a conversation that's happening right now, subterranean maybe for them. Black folks are right now amazed at what's going on in this moment. Amazed because we see people coming out into the street and marching and saying things and doing things and paying attention to racial inequality in ways that they haven't done before. But there's also another conversation, at least I'll speak for myself, and say, I'm wondering how long this will last. When will shoes drop again? It's hard to believe that finally this is wake up time in America about issues of race that we've been talking about for so long. My God, I hope it is. But after you've been beaten down for so long as a people, it is hard to accept or think that there isn't another 2x4 that's going to be coming at your head after this moment passes. And that's something we should be aware of.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the way you talked about the structural elements that lead to problems like, let's say, arrest for drug use. The famous school to prison pipeline is what you're describing in part. And many people assume, oh, people go to jail because of bad individual choices. What I think is really important about institutional racism is the way structures of education, for example, place people on different trajectories. And it's so difficult to alter that. So it's not just a matter of bad choices. This is what institutions do to affect people.
Yes, yes. I live in a neighborhood in Chapel Hill that's beautiful. It is unpoliced for the most part.
Yeah.
Not the way I came up.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I'm going to turn to some questions that have been coming in here. I have a list of a few questions. A couple of the questions have to do with the nature of, well, one question has to do with the nature of admissions to colleges and the way in which that affects the way colleges work. Should there be more attention to certain racial disparities in education as part of the admission process? And then a related question, what about the leadership of the university? Do members of boards of trustees, of governing bodies, do they make a difference in the way outcomes evolve in the university and in other institutions? So I'm going to come back to Pat because this also has to do with education. What about those issues?
Well, I want to start with the last question, leadership, since that is the area of the focus of my research. And, you know, Professor Shaw talked about having the will to make change. And I think that's the level at which we can seriously start, you know, take a serious look at that question. Do you have the will to change structures and to make some of these structural changes? So let me just say one more thing about what that looks like. Again, from a communication perspective, I think that it's so important to start at the level of a critical self-reflection about how you understand race. I think, you know, we understand that this is a structural, you know, racism operates at the structural level, but there are individuals who are moving those structures, making decisions. I mean, that's a part of institutionalization. And so I think if leaders ask themselves, not am I racist? That is not the question, because you know, I'll go back to Professor Bonilla Silva that I mentioned earlier. You know, all of us can perpetuate a racist system, right? But the question is, can I see the racist system? I think that, you know, the horrible way that George Floyd died in front of us for 8 minutes. People have talked about the fact that it's, you know, 8 minutes and 46 seconds. The question that I think is that the United States of America has to, how did we create a system in which that is possible? And I think that's the compelling, you know, something that's brought this as a compelling way to think about this question, can I see race? And I think that's when people are protesting, and perhaps the people who are watching us and, you know, listening to this webinar are coming because I want to see, like, how did I miss this? If I've missed something, I want to know what it is. I think that's an absolutely hopeful place for us to be in. So Professor Shaw, I would say, this Black person is saying, I have hope that it's different this time. And so I think that's the question. So I would ask the leaders, including the Board of Trustees, and just seeing I don't know if any of you watched the deliberations where the decision was made, the vote was made to lift the moratorium. There was some critical self-reflection in that meeting, not among everyone, but you know, I study Ella Baker's philosophy of community engagement and community change, and the power of people who are you know, who are the voiceless, right? And usually these are people who in poor communities. There's always, people respond to oppression in so many different ways. Sometimes unproductive, sometimes in productive ways. Ms. Baker would find who has the analysis of race, and let's go support that person to make change. And so I would scale that up to the level of, so in terms of thinking about people in privileged places who now are in this place of saying, how can I understand race? We need to engage with those people who are asking that question, give them the tools that they need and work alongside them. And that's how we change the system. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that's the answer I wanted to give you that I think is important right now. You're on mute. You're on mute. I don't want to miss a word.
I am so sorry. The other question about admissions as a process for social change as well.
Yeah, I think I might defer to Ted on that, because of course there's the Supreme Court case that UNC has been involved in that has something to do with race and admissions. And so I'll defer to the legal minds on this panel to answer that. But I will say that this question of having the will to change the structural aspect of racism comes down to those kinds of decisions, admissions decisions. I think one of the programs that we have right now is the Covenant Scholars. So extending, seeking out who is being left out. Again, it starts with this analysis, right? The question of how did we get here and how can we dismantle it? Mm-hmm. And I have to tell you, as a person who's a chair of a department, I'm not saying that, I do want to say that it's difficult. I am a Black woman who is a chair of a historically white department, and it's difficult to make change. And I want to use every resource in this moment. And our students on this campus are the ones who are leading the way to challenge us and to kind of give us that context to start to try to do that. I don't want to get away from the admissions part, but I think that's a part of that change, to look at every place and then have the will to say, this is how we change the structures.
So let me go to the police as well. I'll come back to you, Ted, on the legal issue of admissions, perhaps, that Pat just mentioned. One of the big questions is, what is the relation between leadership and then what each of us as individuals can do or should do? It seems that police departments have changed their leadership in many cases, but what can individuals do in this kind of situation, and how important is leadership?
Since that's about police, is that for me, Lloyd?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, Frank, I'm interested in the relation between leaders and others in all of our institutions in terms of making change.
Well, there's no doubt that leadership matters, and having committed leaders is fundamental. But I would say that it's more important to have committed citizens. And when pressure comes from the rank and file and from social movements and from people who are protesting and writing letters and complaining, that's when leaders suddenly find a way forward. Most leaders, are elites. They're pretty happy with the system. It's worked for them. They're the leader. They went to the good schools. They got good education. They were able to be articulate and be elected to public office or to take a leadership position as a chief of police or whatever the leadership position may be. By definition, the world has worked out relatively better for those people than for others. And I don't think we can count on our leaders to sense that there's a crisis and that the system is not working. I think we have to bring that to their attention. I've done a lot of research over the years on why policies change. And one of the things that happens in the world of public policy is that occasionally the government gets interested in understanding all the nuances of a particular social or economic problem. For example, in the 1960s, our government got very focused on the issue of poverty. Why did we have so much poverty? And it used to be in the 1930s that poverty was associated with elderly people because we didn't have a good pension system. And the average person faced a very severe probability, a serious probability of their golden years being with significant risk of poverty. That's not true anymore. Poverty is a childhood phenomenon now. It's a phenomenon among people with families and children. But after we focused on all the various mechanisms of poverty, naturally, because we targeted a greater understanding of the issue, we started to generate more and more programs to alleviate that poverty. And then people started to complain that we had too many programs and they were overlapping and we were getting a bloated government. But it wasn't the poor people who were complaining about that. It was the people for whom those policies were not designed. So I think we go in a kind of a whipsaw manner. And the problem is that the relatively advantaged have so much access to government, and they actually typically run the government, all of our government institutions, that they're really not concerned about many of these problems. So we have to continue, because they don't affect them personally. We have to continually bring attention to our leaders to the severity of the various social problems that really affect us. I think it's more important for us to focus on how much we're concerned about the broken system than it is to propose specific alternative solutions. Not that solutions don't matter, but the solutions will come when we draw attention to the severity of the problem. That's what gives me some hope right now, although I agree with Ted Shaw about the issue of when is the shoe going to drop? How long is this moment going to last? But it's certainly lasting quite some time. And we've had, since Trayvon Martin, there's been a sustained attention to issues of police violence like never before in our history, as far as I know. Not that it's lasted that long. It's getting on to 8-10 years now. We've had a lot of attention. Now you could be discouraged by that because we haven't solved the problems, but I'm actually encouraged in the fact that significant changes are happening.
So I want to come to Chris on this question of leadership. And you just mentioned that at certain points in history, policies have been implemented and then pulled back. Do you think, Chris, one of the common questions is, can government leadership make a difference in issues of structural inequality and racism? How important are leaders and how important are others in the government process?
Yeah, excellent question, Lloyd. So what I would say is, I think leaders matter tremendously. And so I agree with Frank. Public opinion, all right, putting pressure on elected officials oftentimes is a way to get them to move, to get them to act. And yet at the same time, I think what's important to keep in mind is that they do act, that if that pressure is there, it increases the probability tremendously that they actually do something about it. And it's because they want to stay in office, all right, and they want to continue to wield power. They want to continue to be in this position of influence. And so one of the things I like to think about, and I often tell this story, at least some version of it in class, is looking back at the Civil Rights Act. All right, people have different stories about it, but long story short, you have Kennedy gives his address in June '63, gets assassinated. Lyndon Johnson, former Senate Majority Leader, uses his political capital, capitalizes upon the moment, and helps usher in these Civil Rights Acts. Now, again, the story is much more complicated than that. Okay, but that's sort of the version that I've heard, and I like to give undergrads just as a way to kind of think through. Hey, is this how sort of this act came about? These acts came about, the Civil Rights Act. All right, so clearly there's more of a history there. Lloyd, I know you're here, and so I don't want to dismiss all of that important work. But the thing I want to say is that, and again, Johnson isn't a perfect guy. I still need to read those Robert Kramer, I think is how you say the guy's name. I still need to read those books, okay? I have one in my office, so I'm not going to pretend as if I'm an expert, but I've heard about Johnson not necessarily being known as the most racially liberal person. How about I put it that way, all right? And so with those things said, and again, I'm not condoning it. I'm not, I guess I'll make a light of it. But at the end of the day, he helped usher in the Civil Rights Act. No matter if you buy that quick story I just gave you, or whether you have your own version about how exactly these bills came about, at the end of the day, you get the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65, the Fair Housing Act of '68. And those things are on the books. Ted, you can speak more about how much they've actually been impactful and how the Supreme Court has vacillated in their interpretation of it. I don't want to speak to that. But the thing is, those changes came about. And so one of the things that I think is true, and I'm cautiously optimistic, I guess I would say, in terms of how long this will be sustained and when the other shoe will drop. But I do know that elected officials make a difference, right? I do know that the Affordable Care Act, early on in Obama's administration was passed. It's been under assault ever since. Okay, but policy does change. And so who's in that position at the time, I think goes a long way and does matter. So leaders matter, but then also to Frank's point, citizens matter. We have to stay we have to put pressure on individuals. We have to contact state legislators and members of Congress, okay, both senators and members of the House. Let people know how we feel and where we stand. And at the end of the day, now I'll say this as well. Maybe I should save this for the end, Lloyd. But our vote matters. And again, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. That's not my place, okay? But I think at the end of the day, that is an action, that is an outcome that we have some influence over. You can talk to the political scientists about whether or not you can flip an election, and I'm not here to give you a lecture about that, but you do have that power.
So voting does make a big difference. And that's how we get our leaders, after all, in some way.
Thank you, Lloyd. You helped me put it together, Lloyd. I appreciate it.
I learned that in civics class too, but I don't always know if it works. But, so Ted, let me just a final comment on the question of leadership versus the people as a whole, or each of us as an individual. What is the relationship between the two?
Oh, is that for me?
No, I was asking Ted. I was
okay.
To Ted. I'm sorry. Thank you, Chris. No, I was asking about the same issue of leadership versus individual. We as individuals, what do we do? How much do we depend on the leadership of our institutions, universities, courts?
So I was listening intently to Chris. I didn't realize that you were putting this to me. And yes, leadership is important, but elected officials, in many respects, follow. They, it's the exception, I think, these days that you see leadership. I don't want to get too partisan, but certainly in one of the major parties right now, but really maybe in both of them. They're following the what they think the polls are, et cetera, for the most part. And it's a rare moment when you see people step up. Now, what has been happening recently is so shocking to people's sensitivities that people are stepping outside of their normal, acquiescence to the way things work. I wanted to go back though and say something about something Chris said. That was a very rich couple of minutes there. You can talk about Johnson. That's a profoundly important conversation. People think about John F. Kennedy as a civil rights president. Not so much, really. Johnson was. And yes, he had his flaws, but he did as much or more for civil rights as any president at any time, more than FDR. Carter was pretty good on civil rights, but people don't think of him as a great president. I think of him as much better than a lot of other people think about him. But here's the point I really want to make. There has never been a major advance on civil rights, and that's true of legislation. All of the legislation to which Chris referred, it's all been bought and paid for in blood, and that's true in this moment right now. It is only because of the deaths, the repeated deaths of unarmed Black men and women that we're seeing this moment come to fruition. Yesterday, the anniversary, I think it was 5 years, of the Charleston Mother Emanuel church killings. We can't forget those things, but that's what kicked off some of this discourse about Confederate flags and monuments, et cetera. I can't think of that moment without my heart breaking, but I'm also aware that it's related to the moments we're seeing now with respect to Black men and women and how they're treated by the criminal justice system. When Dylan Roof was arrested, I mean, you all know the story. He's on his way to jail and they stopped to buy him a hamburger at Burger King. Think about how Black people are treated when they are arrested, and what we've seen play out in all of these videos. Yeah, leadership, yes, but leadership often has to be shocked into action. And individuals have been shocked into action. The thing about this moment, when we talk about individuals, is this is a movement. And we have not seen a movement in decades. There have been civil rights organizations and lawyers and that work on civil rights, but this is a movement. It is organic, and it is a movement that crosses uh, race, age, religion, gender, sexual orientation. This is an extraordinary moment, like you all. Yes, I hope, I hope, I hope, I hope. But I've learned for a long time ago that hope is a choice in the face of reasons to despair. But people really are stepping forward now. I hope it makes a difference, and it is individuals in this movement now. We don't have who name the leader
Yeah.
of this movement right now. I don't think you can do it. There's no Martin Luther King that would. Now I say that, and of course I think about our own North Carolina's own Reverend Barber, but this is a movement that goes beyond any individual.
Yeah.
And that's a reason for hope.
That really is something striking about this. It's hard to identify national leaders in the way that many movements get linked to some key figures. The most famous figures are the people who have died. That is really a remarkable historical fact, I think. I want to move to a couple of other questions we've gotten. Someone has written in and said, what about the extent to which Mexican Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans are subject to institutional racism, given that they don't have the same history of slavery, enslavement, and things like that? We're talking a lot about how African Americans have been affected by institutional racism. What about these other groups? Does anyone want to make a comment about that? Pat, do you want to? Yeah,
Sure.
go ahead.
Well, I mean, I'll go back to my original comments, which is thinking about how we define racism. Racism is, a system of power and hierarchical relations. And I think that, Kimberly Crenshaw has, sort of brought to our consciousness this notion of intersectionality, right? And it's about how these structures of power intersect in bodies, right? And her wonderful work, if people are thinking about ways to who's sort of at the forefront of this conversation, her African American Policy Forum is something that grew out of her work in terms of thinking about intersectional power. But so I think that it's absolutely imperative that we understand race isn't a biological concept. It's not a contrary to how it was thought of, in earlier times, but in terms of the academy. But it is a social construct that is created through these discourses about hierarchical relations. And I think that people often talk about the original sin being slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Of course that wasn't the annihilation of Native peoples, and sort of the violence against non-white people all over the globe and throughout most of history, I think, is how we understand that it's a figure in ground. I mean, at this moment, we're talking about race against Black bodies, but the groundwork is racism, the scourge of racism that persists and can interpolate any body, right? Because it's a system of power that tries to keep reinventing itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Does anybody else want to comment on that issue of the vulnerability of or institutional racism with other groups apart from the African Americans that we've been talking about?
Well, I'd just like to say that, the term white supremacy, and that's what we've been recognizing and struggling with more than ever. I mean, we've been struggling with it throughout our history, but people are finally waking up to it. And by definition, that's not limited to Black folks. It's Native Americans. There's a history of discrimination against Asian Americans in this country. There's a history of discrimination, certainly against Latinx, Latinos, and Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, and et cetera. That's our history. And so white supremacy subordinates all those groups, or has subordinated all those groups. The Black-white divide has been at the core of this country's racial tensions, but not because it's more important than the way other people of color have been treated. There's no hierarchy, or there should be no hierarchy of victimization status, and we need to address all of these issues.
I wonder why you described the attitude of white supremacy against many groups, and why so many white people buy into that ideology of white supremacy. Even the people who benefit least economically from it, or what sustains that ideology of white supremacy?
I mean, it's what I said earlier, right, about communication and discourse.
Mm-hmm.
In there, that the ideology, I think, was created as a way to justify, if you want, slavery, the annihilation of Native peoples, right? And so you had to have a narrative that went along with that. Otherwise, it would be too contradictory. In one of my books, my first book, I talk about, I wrote a book called Race, Gender, and Leadership, and I talk about the ways in which Black women had to be narrated in a particular way, because enslaved Black women were working alongside Black men in this brutal chattel system of chattel slavery. At the same time that there was this discourse about womanhood being protected. So how can you have those contradictory ideas, Black women being brutalized and womanhood being held up as some sort of standard that's holding up the whole human race? The only way you can do that is to just narrate Black women as non-women.
Mm-hmm.
And so these kinds of narratives, I mean, it's the same thing with Black men in terms of thinking about the images of Black men in, more recently in commercials, but also in film, in, the way that Black masculinity, and I know there are others who can speak on this, and I can I'll have sources if people want, but the ways that Black masculinities are created in a way that is meant to reinforce a particular kind of white masculinity, and to perpetuate race in that way. So I think that's the why. That's the way that, it's through discourse that gets sustained.
Yeah, Frank, go ahead.
Yeah, Lloyd, I was just going to add to what Pat's comments to say that, as Ted mentioned earlier, these things are, baked into the cake, that this is how we grew up. If we grew up in any of the Western countries, if you grew up in England, France, Germany, anywhere in Europe, you grew up with an inculcation and a learning of history that our literature was the greatest literature. Our armies are better than other armies. We earned our world domination because we worked harder and we had greater technological advance. That's what people learned in school. And I would add the other part to it, which is we're accustomed to seeing white people in positions of authority, especially white men. And so we take it for granted that somebody, if you look at, you don't have to look at the Anita Hill Senate hearings to see a panel of white men holding judgment from a position of authority over other people. You can still see it today in so many circumstances. You can see it at our university at the highest levels of the administration. It's white men for the most part, as is true in most institutions. And so without singling out UNC, it's fair enough to say that most major institutions have, you know, a certain profile of person. That's a person that looks like me or you, Lloyd, at the top. And so if you're not, that doesn't fit your profile, you might be a little bit jarred or uncomfortable with that. But if it fits your profile, you know, why question it? It looks good to me.
Mm-hmm. So, Chris, could you say anything about, oh, Ted, you wanted to come back in on that. You need to unmute. Then I want to come back to Chris too. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll try to be quick on this, Chris. We talked about Native Americans, Asian Americans. We talked about Latinx, Mexican Americans, all of that. There's another piece of not only white supremacy, but racism that is well known within African American communities. Maybe not so much outside of African American communities. People don't think about it a whole lot. But racism has infected Black people just as it has infected everybody else. And it's manifested in colorism. So that, you know, somebody who's light skinned like me, largely the consequence, given all of my family research, of the slavery era, but nonetheless, you know, Black people, dark-skinned Black people get treated differently. You know, lighter-skinned Black people have at times bought the Kool-Aid of racism and manifested it in colorism. And that's still a tremendously important issue, a discourse that isn't talked about a whole lot. And it's very complex. We don't have time to talk about it here. But I see Chris nodding, and, you know, I'll pass it over.
Yeah, I wanna go over to Chris and respond to what Ted said, or more generally, the power of white supremacists or white assumptions in political life, or how it sustains itself generation after generation.
Oh yeah, I just want to echo what Ted said. I mean, he's exactly right, and thanks for bringing that to bear, because I think oftentimes it's overlooked in these spaces. Oh goodness, Lord, you know, I'll put it to you this way: the rules of the game, the very structures themselves in politics, often lead to the same groups of people wielding power, and it kind of gets to what Frank said. I mean, if you're used to seeing a certain profile, it actually seems like you have to move heaven and earth to do something different in order to get a different type of person to serve an office. So I'll just talk briefly here. So my research is on Black representation. And so I look at what factors account for African Americans serving more in a state legislature. And one of the things I find is it's not surprising, but it's still evidence for it, which is that states that have larger African American populations tend to have more African American state legislators. There's long been this association between having Black people and the idea that African Americans will want to vote for someone like themselves, to see themselves reflected in office and so forth. Okay. Now it's funny. I only thought about this a little bit, and so bear with me as I process this more in this space. But it's occurred to me, all right, throughout the process of doing my research, that when it comes to explaining where white people serve, I wouldn't expect the same pattern to exist. All right. And so the reason why would be Black people have always voted for white individuals. I mean, who else would you vote for, right? And so I think I made my point. So I guess what I'm saying is it's really important, and the fact that there is a trend that accounts for whether or not more African Americans serve. I'm familiar with research that looks at the extent to which women serve in office, the same for Latinos. It's a similar relationship in terms of this idea of demographics as destiny. The fact that race matters so much for seeing non-white people in office, and yet it's not as consequential for whether you see white people in office, I think tells us a lot about the structures themselves, about who people are used to seeing in positions of power. The fact that you actually have to describe someone as African-American or as Latino or as something else. And it's because the default, right, the baseline is white, and the baseline is also male. And so even in the very way we use language, again, Pat, I don't want to get too far into this, I'm not a communications expert, but even in the way in which we use language and label things speaks to these things, it speaks to the structures themselves. Yeah.
Do you think this is why there was so much anger about Barack Obama? Because he didn't fit those categories and images that the narrative had constructed?
Oh, Well, how much time do we have? I'll be brief.
Well, I
So-
didn't mean to get us off on Barack Obama.
no, that's good. Look,
There-
yeah, I would
there's
say
the-
yes. I think that yes. I mean, I think 95% or so of Black people voted for President Obama, and I think the first time around, 43% of whites voted for him. So yes, I mean, in fact, I guess I will take advantage of this opportunity. I had the opportunity to teach a first-year seminar at UNC. I taught it once. I've only once. I'm teaching it again this fall, called the Obama Presidency. So I laugh like that because I have an entire class where I look at Obama and I look at Shirley Chisholm and before him, all right, and Jesse Jackson. And then I look at Obama and how did he get to office? What are the consequences of his presidency? One brief thing here, Lloyd, be mindful of time. In my mind, there is no President Trump without Barack Obama. I see President Trump's election as a direct reaction, backlash, I dare say, to the first Black president.
Mhm. So in fact, people trying to make it like it's, like it's supposed to be, to use the language Frank had of the images of what kind of people belong in leadership roles.
But
Pat?
I do want to just one caveat there. Language and you know, some symbols are a manifestation of a particular discourse, right? Of who belongs and who doesn't. But the foundation of that is power, right? So, you know, it may be, you know, we may be operating at this symbolic level, who belongs, you know, who doesn't, but it really is, it goes deeper into these sort of understandings of maintaining power and losing control. And sometimes people don't have the language for that. People don't have the language to understand sometimes the tension and turmoil that's happening when they see a Black president. Okay, doesn't belong, maybe, but can it go deeper to this? I am somehow losing control of something and it's important and I'm not going to stand for it.
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, so in my work, and I'll just add here, maybe we're going to, in terms of what we can do, but one of the tools that I've used, once you can get people in the room who say, I want to see race or I can see race, I think is something that's called theater of the oppressed. It's a performative kind of way of having a dialogue, because it recognizes that sometimes people don't have the language to understand what they're feeling or what, you know, how they're interacting with systems of race. And so having these ways of really seeing how oppression and race lives in our bodies is a way forward. And I can offer folks resources on that if they like. But yeah, I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I think you're absolutely right that language is incredibly empowering. I think historical knowledge is also, if I may just put in a little plug, because the more you think, you know, if you just think, oh, this is the way it is. No, it's this way because of a historical pattern that constructed it. And the more you understand that, the more empowering it becomes. Go ahead, Frank. I have another question, but go ahead.
I just wanted to add another element of this perpetuation analysis that we've been doing. How do these structures get perpetuated for so long? And it's about mentorship and how leaders pick the next generation of leaders, starting from our elementary school teachers and through the education system, and then into institutions of government and businesses and all kinds of institutions. People in positions of authority either choose or do not choose to make a special effort to find somebody to help bring them along the way. And that's where I think teachers really matter, and the diversity of our faculty and our instructional staff at UNC is severely lacking. And throughout higher education, we have the same problem, except in HBCUs, but throughout historically white institutions, we have an incredible problem with diversity in academia. But I would just go back to elementary school. It goes back way further. And when you think that if the teacher is more likely to be white, and that teacher might be more comfortable working with the student, or just feel socially more connected or culturally more connected or just racially more connected, but in any case, more easily connected to certain students rather than to others, it makes a big difference. And so it's not only that the younger people adopt a norm of who looks like they should be in power. It's also that some younger people get empowered and pulled along, and other people get relatively ignored or taught implicitly and sometimes explicitly that they don't have the skills to be the next generation of leaders. And I think we have a huge responsibility to try to diversify our faculty just for that reason.
So this actually leads to the next question we received. Do we have a way to measure implicit bias and the way implicit bias affects outcomes within institutions? What you're saying is that implicit bias could be even more powerful than explicit bias in shaping outcomes?
Implicit bias, explicit bias, and institutional practice, and doing things the way we've always done it will recreate the system that's already there. So I think we really have to think about, for example, I was very good at taking tests when I was young. So I did well enough on the SAT to get a scholarship to go to college. And I did well enough on the GRE to get into a good graduate program. So hooray for me. I'm really happy about that. But when I sit on a faculty committee and we talk about the biases, social class, racial bias, cultural bias, foreign, non-English first language speakers of the standardized testing industry. Everyone else in the room is like me because we didn't get in the room by having a poor score on the GRE exam. And since the GRE selected all of us to get into a top grad school, which is how we got to be professors at UNC, we all think it's great on average. I have the hardest time getting my colleagues to think that maybe there's some cultural biases to the selection process that put them in the same room that I'm in. They don't want to believe that. And so we have all kinds of things. That's not an implicit bias. That's an institutional practice. It doesn't matter who the people are. If we use the GRE exam, we're going to have a relatively homogeneous graduate program as compared to if we were to eliminate that. I could go on, but it also has to do with our ideas of what's a prestigious undergraduate institution. That's another form of institutional bias.
And this is one of the issues that is to be addressed, I think, as we rethink not only admissions into graduate school, but recruitment of faculty and promotion and tenure practices. These all get connected.
Most of my white colleagues throughout the industry of higher education over the years that I've been in it, which is over 35, just don't think it's a very big problem that we don't have high diversity. They say it's a problem. They say it's a priority, but when push comes to shove, it gets to be the 5th or 6th priority, and the number 1, 2, 3, and 4 priorities get taken more seriously. So I think that's the big problem.
I have one more question before we come to our final point. Someone has written to say, what does it mean to decolonize the curriculum and to decolonize the way in which we operate our introductory programs in the university? You use this term decolonized communications, Pat. Could you say a little more about that concept and what it means?
I can. Actually, I wrote an article, co-wrote with several colleagues, 2 articles, one called Decolonizing the Academy, and one called Decolonizing the Classroom. And both those articles were based on our experience of creating the graduate certificate in participatory research. In short, to decolonize is to start to think about the colonial structures, right, that were able to, so where enslavement of people were manifested, right, and the annihilation of whole generations of people it was made possible through colonizing practices. And so that colonizing process is around silencing, it's around segregation, it's around using power to create systems that are systems of knowledge production, right, that are reinforcing the a status quo or dominant ideology, in this case, white supremacy. So in the graduate certificate in participatory research, we have created a system on campus of, I should say a community on campus of graduate students, mostly student-led, graduate students, faculty, some staff, who understand that when we do research as a research university, we often go into communities, and sometimes that research, our own research practices are colonizing. We go in and we extract data without the communities knowing what's going to happen with that data, or so we do research on communities, and sometimes, you know, when there is the opportunity to do knowledge production with people in communities. And in classrooms, we create, in the certificate, we have these an interdisciplinary course that we call Decolonizing Methodologies, and we bring students from many different disciplines, from the social sciences, the School of Public Health, from humanities and so forth. And sometimes there's disciplinary practices that are colonizing, right? And so we try to construct a classroom setting in which this idea of knowledge production having equity in producing knowledge can take place. So those are the ways that that's how I'm thinking about
it. In fact, also a challenge of hierarchical systems in some way, the hierarchy of knowledge as well as the hierarchy.
Yes. And who belongs? I mean, the idea of the curriculum, I didn't respond specifically to that, which is to say, who, this is the debate about the canon, right? So who, in philosophy, for example, white European philosophers often are seen as the bedrock of, we all, in my field, we have doctorates of philosophy, right? And those philosophies in my discipline get re-inscribed in terms of thinking about these European philosophers, and where the philosophies that come from, feminists, like Black feminist research and theories and philosophies, and other indigenous philosophies are not seen as part of the canon. What in the 70s was called ethnic studies, but it was, even that can sometimes be marginalized, right? So how do we mainstream and decolonize the canon?
Okay, well, I appreciate everybody's comments through this whole conversation. We're going to end with a final question. And the question is this: what for you are the takeaways from this conversation, especially for people, and I would include especially white people perhaps? What is the takeaway for people who want to address the issues of institutional racism in their communities, local communities, and or in the university? So this is a very big question. I'm going to ask for a short answer, and I'm going to start in reverse order the way we began. I'm going to start with Ted. What are your takeaways from this conversation as we look for a way forward, a constructive way forward?
Well, let me try to say this quickly, and I hope people take this in the spirit in which it's offered. I think there's a lot of work that white people have to do to figure out what their place is and where they stand with respect to dismantling white supremacy and its legacy. That's not the work of people of color to tell them how to do that. Too often, it's like people of color have to carry all of this. We didn't create it. And I don't think it's our role to uncreate it, even though we have to fight against it, and we'll continue to do that. But here's the other thing that I want to say. There have always been white people who have seen what is right. People excuse people from the 1700s and say they were products of their time. There were white people who did not hold slaves or who manumitted slaves. So the people who didn't, the Jeffersons and others, they don't get off the hook that way. I'm saying that there's a lot of white people then and now. You know, we need more. But white folks have to figure that out. I'm thankful for anybody who fights for and believes in racial justice.
Thank you. Thank you, Ted. I want to go now to Chris. Your takeaway from this conversation and a constructive way forward, including
Yeah.
for people.
Yeah, no, thank you for this. So I think, first of all, you all are here, and that's a step. I'm not going to completely let you off the hook and say, okay, you check this box, let's move on and go back to business as usual. But this is the first step. So I went to St. Louis University, Jesuit Catholic education. So I took theology, philosophy. I always like to use this word metanoia, a change of heart. So we need a change of heart, and we also need to put information in our minds. And it starts small. It can start, first of all, by attending something like this, having conversations with those with whom you're close. And I think what I would say is, and again, I'm gonna show, Frank will know this, and Ted, I think, I like old school music, Pat, as well. So Teddy Pendergrass has his song, Wake Up Everybody. And I heard that song the other day, and it almost moved me to tears. It's a beautiful song, all right? Old Teddy P. And in all seriousness, wake up. Begin to look around, begin to look at these structures that are in place, and realize that, you know, the folks that are in positions of power didn't necessarily get there because they're the most talented, but due in part to because of how they were, where they were born, and the conditions under which they were born. And I think be willing for things to change, be willing to be uncomfortable. And maybe this conversation in some ways was uncomfortable, and if so, that's good. But be willing to change where you shop. You know, if you're a person of faith, think about where you worship and what does that look like? What does your neighborhood look like? What do your friendship circles look like? Begin to question these things. And then also think about, you know, how you act politically, right? Economically, how you live your life, and be willing for things to change.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. I appreciate that challenge also, rethinking ourselves. Frank, your response to the question of a takeaway from this conversation and where we go from here?
Sure. Thanks for asking. That's a good question. I feel like the biggest thing especially for white Americans to think about is whether or not the system is broken. Are we comfortable with the system? In the past, I think many people have, in a knee-jerk kind of fashion, thought that, well, the system's not broken. I support the status quo. Even I would like to go back to the quote unquote good old days when things were simpler. And that's always been a difficult thing for me to ever hear. And I'm sure it is for everybody else on this panel. So I think we have to ask ourselves, is the system working hunky-dory or is the system broken? And if we believe that the system is broken, even though it might be broken less for someone who looks like me than for other people, but if we can put ourselves in that other person's shoes and recognize that none of us are going to be better off in the long term if the system continues to generate these massive inequities. Okay, so if the system is broken, then we have to recognize that we need some solutions. So we have to first do an analysis about whether we're comfortable with the status quo. If we're not comfortable, we have to get on board with some proposals. And the last thing I want to mention is we have to recognize also that other people are going to be angry. And we have to be comfortable with that anger on the part of other people. Everybody's not an academic. Everybody's not analyzing these things in an abstract manner. People are living through it. And people on all sides are going to go through some real emotional struggles in various ways. And we have to let people act out, let people express their frustration and their anger and their impatience in particular as we think about solutions. And move on after we allow people to express those frustrations. We can expect it. It's human nature.
Yeah, and anger is going to be part of the history of this whole process. It always is. Pat, you get the last word.
Well, my last word is hope. And the hope that I have coming out of this moment and out of this conversation is that people will begin to start that process, if they haven't already, of critical self-reflection, to think about what are the biases that exist in me, but also what is blocking me from seeing race. And just to ask that question, you don't have to see it, but just asking that question and then finding a way to have an analysis. Each one of my colleagues here, I think, has said this in a different way in terms of having a way of understanding, is the system broken? And the system is broken, right? How are you getting an analysis of race and how power is operating in that? And then find a way to go to the difficulty. Don't go away from the difficulty. If there's a tension or a contradiction, find a place where you can dialogue with someone who also has an analysis and work it out and figure out, now what do we do to change things? This is my hope. I believe in Ella Baker's philosophy. I wrote a book about that. I'll do a shameless plug of my book coming out in November from the University of California Press.
Good.
That is all about having those dialogues.
So I want to thank you each for contributing to this dialogue. I want to say I've been at UNC for 34 years, and I think each year presents new challenges, but I don't think I've ever seen us reach such a convergence of challenges as we're facing right now. But the one thing that gives me hope, I'm going to use your word, Pat, is that we're engaged and we're looking for a way forward, and somehow we will push forward. And on that, I will hand the torch of progress back to Kat and the GAA with my deep appreciation to Ted Shaw, Frank Baumgartner, Chris Clark, and Patricia Parker.
Thanks, Lloyd, and thanks to all our wonderful panelists. I really appreciate you taking the time to spend with us and talk through this important discussion and topic. Thanks to Paul Benici for the behind the scenes work and getting everyone organized and managing the Zoom technology behind this. We really appreciate it. It wouldn't happen without him. The session tonight was recorded and we will make it available to everyone. And I will likely reach out to the panelists and see if they have any recommendations, either for websites or books that you would like me to share, because I will follow up with everyone who registered. And it could be a good opportunity to share some resources. So thank you, and everyone stay well and take care.